Well, thank you very much for that warm introduction. And thank you very much, everyone, for being here this evening. And to everyone watching online, thank you for joining as well. It is a great privilege to be delivering my inaugural lecture tonight on the topic of automation anxiety. And I want to begin by providing a little bit of context. And not only this lecture, but indeed put the entire lecture series in some context as well. We live at an extraordinary time where almost every day we hear stories of systems and machines taking on tasks and activities which until very recently we thought only human beings alone could ever do. Making medical diagnoses and driving cars, drafting legal contracts and designing buildings, composing music and writing news reports. I think the moment that really brought what's going on to people's attention was in November 2023, when ChatGPT, of course, became the fastest growing app in terms of users ever. And that really is just the start. If you listen to what the leaders of the large AI companies say today, whether it's Demis Hassabis at DeepMind, Dario Amodei at Anthropic, Sam Altman at OpenAI, all of them are saying roughly the same thing, that within a decade, they are going to build a system that can outperform human beings at all economically useful tasks. Now, I know that those sorts of claims might sound a little bit like science fiction, and there are reasons to treat those claims with skepticism, not least the strong financial interest that the leaders of these large companies have in talking up the capabilities of their technologies. But let me just give you at the outset 3 reasons why I think we need to be taking the spirit of some of these claims seriously today. The first is just the extraordinary amount of financial resource we are currently directing at artificial intelligence. It's quite hard to find a similar moment in human history where we've invested so much in the pursuit of a single technical problem. I think probably the Apollo project, the moon landing, is the closest you get. Just for a bit of context, Stuart Russell, the great computer scientist, estimates that we are currently investing 10 times what we did in the Manhattan Project in the pursuit of artificial intelligence. So that is the first reason I think we need to take these claims seriously, just the extraordinary financial resource we're putting into the pursuit of these technologies. The second are the extraordinarily talented people that we're encouraging to enter that world as well. I found this chart in the Washington Post recently really striking. Share of bachelor's degrees in the US by major, and what looks like just a few years after 2020, the share of bachelor's degrees in the US neck and neck with the share of bachelor's degrees in all humanities. There is a sense in which we are reorganizing higher education in pursuit of this narrow technical goal, building these very capable AIs. And the third observation, alongside the extraordinary resources that we're putting behind these technologies, is the fact that we are making progress. And I think this is perhaps the most important. These companies are making progress. And there's lots of ways of seeing this. I think one that particularly struck me in the last few weeks was a piece in the Financial Times that explained how artificial intelligence is improving at such a rate that it's outstripping our capacity to generate new benchmarks with which to monitor progress. And anyone who's interested in following some of these benchmarks and seeing that progress in action, have a look at Epoch AI, which has a sort of collection of different benchmarks. And it's quite an interesting way of getting lots of different angles on where we are in developing these technologies. And so, taken together, I do think we need to at least take the claims of these large technology companies seriously. We might disagree. In fact, we should disagree about how likely or not they are to develop these technologies, but we should all be considering it as a possibility, whoever we are, whether we're a politician or a policymaker, a business leader, someone worrying about the future of their own career, a parent, their child, whoever it might be, we need to be thinking about these sorts of claims. Now, this technological progress, both what we currently see and the promise of even more to come, it's really remarkable. But I think it's important to remember that however remarkable it might seem, it hasn't come out the blue. It's worth remembering that this technological progress is a chapter in a far longer story. It's a story that I've been exploring for the last 15 years or so. I've written 3 books, one in 2015, another in 2020, most recently in 2024. But the story that runs through all of these is one where new technologies gradually but relentlessly take on more and more of the tasks that we thought only human beings alone could ever do. And it's this bigger story that I want to begin to explore this evening at Gresham with you all. I think understanding the consequences of AI, particularly for work, is one of the great challenges of our time. And it might seem strange to hear this, but when we look back on this particular moment in decades to come, when people come to write the history books of 2025, I think there is a very good chance that what people will remember is not President Trump, it's not the war in Ukraine, however remarkable these characters and events might be, but what is happening at the moment in artificial intelligence. This is a very important time. And so in this first lecture tonight, I want to do 5 things with you. The first is I want to talk about what I call automation anxiety. So this is the fear that the remarkable technologies of our time, the technologies that I've just described, are likely to take on many of the jobs that we do. Automation anxiety is really bubbling up today. People are worried about the future of their work. But what I want to show is how this fear, this anxiety, is in fact an old one. That ever since modern economic growth began 2.5 centuries ago, people have suffered from periodic bursts of anxiety that the technologies of the time would take on the work that they do, that would destroy the jobs that they do. And I also want to show, very importantly, that time and time again, this automation anxiety has turned out to be misplaced. There has always been enough work for people to do. So should we just dismiss this automation anxiety, given this history? Can we just say, look, people worried in the past that these new technologies would take on their jobs, and they were wrong, so we just shouldn't take seriously people who worry at the moment in the same way. They are likely to be wrong as well. The fundamental argument of this lecture is going to be not so fast. I think we do need to take automation anxiety very seriously. And to explain why, I want to take you back to the Industrial Revolution, another moment in our history of extraordinary technological change. And what we're going to see is that people back then suffered from extraordinary automation anxiety. They worried that what the new technologies of their time, from the spinning jenny to the roller spinner, they worried that they would reduce the number of jobs that had to be done. And I'm going to show that those worries turned out to be wrong, but I also want to explain why this is not the end of it. That these people back then also worried about what the technologies of their time would do to the nature of the jobs that had to be done, not simply the number. And what we're going to see is that those worries, in fact, were completely right. Yes, during the Industrial Revolution, people did tend to find new work when they were displaced by new technology, but what was happening in the labor market back then was far from gentle or benign. During the Industrial Revolution, technologies were undermining the pay of work, the quality of work, the status of work, and creating new imbalances of both economic and political power. And this history matters because I think we see a very similar story unfolding today. Today, commentary on the future of work is dominated by worries about the number of jobs that are going to have to be done in the future. Think how often you come across a variation on the headline in the press, is a robot going to take my job? But we actually see new technologies like AI doing very little to the number of jobs alone at the moment. Where change is really happening at the moment is in the nature of jobs. And that is going to be the central lesson of this evening. Narrowly focusing on the number of jobs, which we tend to do, is unhelpful. If we really want to understand the impact of artificial intelligence on the future of work, we have to consider not only, again, how the number of jobs might change, but how the nature of those jobs might change as well. So that's the plan, and I want to dive straight in and begin with this idea of automation anxiety. And I want to start by telling a story, the Great Manure Crisis of the 1890s. And the Great Manure Crisis of the 1890s should have come as no surprise. For some time, in big cities like London and New York, the most popular forms of transport had relied upon horses, hundreds of thousands of them, to heave cabs, carts, wagons, wains, and a whole variety of other vehicles through the streets. And with these horses came manure. In fact, huge amounts of it. One enthusiastic health officer working in Rochester, New York, calculated that the horses in his city alone produced enough manure to cover an acre of land to a height of 175 feet. It was almost as tall as the Leaning Tower of Pisa. Apocryphally, people at the time extrapolated from these calculations to a sort of inescapably manure-filled future. A New York commentator who predicted that piles would soon reach the height of third-story windows. A London reporter who imagined that by the middle of the 20th century, the streets would be buried under 9 feet of the stuff. And I should say, I wasn't entirely satisfied with this newspaper clipping on the screen, so I did turn to ChatGPT to create some photos of what the Great Manure Crisis would have actually looked like. This was its first attempt. I thought it was fine, didn't feel sufficiently like a crisis. So I asked it to make it slightly more crisis-like. I thought this was better. Still not a crisis, so it said the prompt, more of a crisis, please. Now this did seem like a crisis, and just for a little bit of fun, I thought I'd up the crisis once more. That was too much crisis. The serious point here, though, is it said at the time, back in the 1890s, policymakers just didn't know what to do. They couldn't simply ban horses from the street. They were far too economically important. But the twist in the tale is that in the end, policymakers didn't need to worry. In the 1870s, the first internal combustion engine was built. In the 1880s, it was installed in the first automobile. And only a few decades later, Henry Ford brought cars to the mass market with his famous Model T. By 1912, New York had more cars than horses. 5 years after that, the last horse-drawn tram was decommissioned in the city. The Great Manure Crisis was over. So the parable of horseshit, as Elizabeth Kolber called it in The New Yorker, has been told many times over the years. And in most versions of the story, the decline of horses is cast in an optimistic light, as a tale of technological triumph. But for this man, Wassily Leontief, a Russian-American economist who would win the Nobel Prize in 1973, the same event suggested a far more unsettling conclusion. What he saw instead was how a new technology, this combustion engine, had taken a creature that for millennia had played a central role in economic life and banished it to the sidelines. And then in a set of articles in the early 1980s, Leontief made one of the most infamous claims in modern economic thought. What technological progress had done to horses, he said, it would eventually do to human beings as well, drive us out of work. What cars and tractors were to them, computers and robots would be to us. And today, as I said at the start, the world is gripped again by Leontief's fear. In the US, 30% of workers now believe that their jobs are likely to be replaced by robots and computers in their lifetime. Here in the UK, the same proportion think it could happen in the next 20 years. This is a fear of what economists call technological unemployment, a fear that new technologies might displace people from their work. Or put another way, it's what we can think of as automation anxiety, a fear that using new technologies is also going to mean less demand for the work that we do as well. Importantly, though, as mentioned at the start, automation anxiety is not new. As I said, ever since modern economic growth began, this is quite interesting, 2 or 3 centuries ago, people have suffered from it. And perhaps the first and the most famous example are the Luddites. So during the Industrial Revolution in Britain, immense anxiety that the technologies of the time are going to destroy jobs. And that spilled into protest and dissent. Anxious people went around Britain smashing new technologies, from spinning jennies to roller spinners. And during the Industrial Revolution, this technological vandalism was really quite widespread. And these marauders were known as the Luddites, and they took their name from this man, Ned Ludd, who was an apocryphal East Midlands weaver who was said to have smashed a set of framing machines at the start of the Industrial Revolution. Now, Ned probably wasn't a real person, but the disturbances that his flag bearers caused certainly were. And in 1812, the British Parliament felt forced to pass the Destruction of Stocking Frames, etc. Act. This made destroying machines a crime punishable by death. And several people were, in fact, charged and executed as a result. And these are just some of the posters from that time. Each of them are offering financial rewards for anyone who could give the authorities information on those who were destroying machines around the country. Now, jump to the present day, and you can see the same automation anxiety unfolding. Now, in the last few years, we have seen a frenzy of books and articles and reports on the threat of automation. And it's not just confined, and this is important, to the pages of books. People today, knowingly or otherwise, have been channeling some of the more hands-on action of those Luddites, whether it's setting fire to driverless cars in Los Angeles, attacking autonomous delivery robots in the streets, destroying works of art created by artificial intelligence. Automation anxiety is clearly back today. Nor, in fact, are these modern cases, the most recent cases, a one-off repeat, a one-off flare-up of automation anxiety. Even as early as the 1940s, this debate about technological unemployment, this idea that people might lose their jobs due to powerful new technologies, it was already so commonplace that the New York Times felt comfortable calling it an old argument. Crawling through the archive of the New York Times, I found it was possible in almost every decade since 1920 to find a piece engaging in some way with the threat of technological unemployment. And yet, here is the really interesting thing. The primary fear that has driven automation anxiety over the years, this repeated fear that new technologies are going to destroy jobs and leave large pools of permanently unemployed people, that has turned out to be completely misplaced. Up until 1900, there's no sign of these large pools of unemployed people. Yeah, there's been some ups and downs, but fundamentally, unemployment's been hovering around 5% in Britain since the Industrial Revolution. Today, despite all the extraordinary technologies that we see around us, despite all the stories of remarkable technological progress over the last couple of decades, unemployment is still at record lows in many parts of the world. In the US, for instance, just a couple of years ago, fell to the lowest rate in 50 years. And so, the important question for us is, what should we make of the automation anxiety that we see bubbling up around us today? Do we need to worry? Again, if people who suffered from automation anxiety in the past were just wrong to worry repeatedly, if there were no permanent pools of unemployed people, if technological unemployment just never happened, do we need to worry? And if we were to worry, would we just be repeating very similar mistakes to the past? Is this time different? Now, one response is to say, well, in fact, this time is different, that perhaps our anxious ancestors were wrong to worry in the past that the technologies of their time would affect the number of jobs, but this time is different. Today's technologies are more remarkable. Their impact is likely to be more substantial. And this time, unlike in the past, these technologies will affect the number of jobs. Now, whether this time is in fact different, I think is a really important question, and I'm going to return to it in later lectures. And I think there are good reasons to think this time is different. But I actually want to put that question to one side today for this opening lecture. And instead, I want to explore a different reason we should worry, a different reason to take automation anxiety seriously. And the worry is that new technologies might harm not the number of jobs, but the nature of jobs. You see, today, we write the Luddites off. And they were clearly wrong in their primary fear that these technologies would lead to a decline in the number of jobs. That just didn't happen. And that's why today we use the term Luddite as a term of disparagement. That if we think that someone doesn't really understand how technology works, perhaps, or if they're worrying unduly about its harmful consequences, then we dismiss them as Luddites. We brush them off as technologically illiterate, just as the original Luddites were mistaken to think that a world without work awaited them. Many of those articles before of those modern-day machine smashers described those people as neo-Luddites, modern-day Luddites. But what we all too often forget is that those original Luddites actually got something very important right. Yes, they were wrong in their primary fear, that these technologies might reduce the number of jobs, but they were right to think and recognize that these technologies would undermine the nature of those jobs. They had legitimate grievances. So what were those grievances? And that's what I want to turn to now. The first concerns the pay of work. Work in their time, pay for their work stagnated, in spite of the remarkable increases in productivity that became possible with the new technologies of their time. Second, the quality of work in their time collapsed. Thirdly, the status of certain work withered away. And finally, again, these great inequalities in economic and political power emerged. And I want to just take some time now just to explore each of these in turn. And again, this isn't just going to be, it's not just an interesting historical exercise. It's very useful for making sense of what's going on in the world of work today and thinking about how technology is reshaping the jobs that we all do. Put another way, what should worry us is not that the future might be different from the past. This time is different. But that the future might in fact be like the past. And because of that, there are reasons to worry. So first, pay. What technology did or did not do to pay. The Industrial Revolution was a time of completely extraordinary technological progress. James Watt invents the steam engine, a new method of generating power. James Hargreaves invents the spinning jenny, so spinners could be far more productive and spin far more yarn. Edmund Cartwright invents the power loom, so weavers can weave more cloth. Everyone in society seems to be becoming more productive through these new technologies. And you might expect if people are becoming more productive and their work is becoming more valuable, well, then everyone ought to be getting better paid. Not so. Here are English wages from 1209 to 2009 in England. What do you see? Real wages in England do not really rise during the Industrial Revolution. Now, there are debates about when the Industrial Revolution began. Some people say it was in the 1760s, perhaps the 1780s. Other people put it later, say no, 1800. The key point for us is that nothing historically serious really happens to wages in England until the turn of the 19th century, over a century after these innovations are introduced. Remarkable technological progress, but nothing much of interest happens to wages during that time. Another way to see it is shown here. So this chart shows real wages and real GDP per worker. So real GDP per worker is that top line, real wages is the bottom line. And this is from 1770 to 1900. And what they show is that until 1840, GDP per worker, so if you were to think of the economy as a pie, as economists like to do, and slice that pie up into equal slices for everyone in the economy, GDP per worker is the size of those individual slices of the pie. Until 1840, which is that very faintly dashed line, if you can see it there in about the middle of the chart, that top line, GDP per worker, is rising. What this means is that the economy is growing. Each person is, in a sense, contributing more to the economy than before. But look at that bottom line, which is real wages. They remain roughly constant. There's a gap emerging between those two lines, between 1770, the sort of start of the Industrial Revolution, and 1840. The point is, the gains from all these remarkable technological innovations that are unfolding from this growing, more productive economy, they're not going to workers in the form of pay. So the economic historian Robert Allen called what's going on here Engels' pause. And he called it Engels' pause after this man, Friedrich Engels, who wrote a book on the conditions of the working class in England in 1844. Just a little extract from that book. The English middle classes prefer to ignore the distress of the workers, and this is particularly true of the industrialists, who grow rich on the misery of the mass of wage earners. There's a sense that some people in society are benefiting from these extraordinary technologies, and other people, the workers, just aren't. And that's the story there. Now, why does this matter, fast forward today, for thinking about today? Well, there is, in a sense, I think, a legitimate story to be told that the remarkable technologies of the time, even if they're not affecting the number of jobs that have to be done, are clearly not leading to increases in average pay. You know, we can point to remarkable moments of technological progress over the last 10, 15, 20 years, and yet look at the story of real wages in the UK since the financial crisis. It's a time of extraordinary technological progress, yet average real wages here in Britain haven't really risen for 16 or 17 years. It's their worst run since the Napoleonic Wars. So that, I think, is the first reason to be alive to this idea of automation anxiety. That even if we enjoy remarkable technological progress, that doesn't necessarily translate into higher pay for workers. The second dimension that I think is really important is the quality of work. What must it have actually been like to live through the Industrial Revolution? What must have happened to the quality of life, the quality of work back then? Well, one way to do this, is to understand this, is to go to the writers who sort of chronicled what life was like in their writing. And so, you know, one window into this is the poetry, of course, of William Blake. 1804, his preface to a book that he wrote, Milton, a Poem in Two Books. We know it, of course, as the lyrics to the hymn Jerusalem. And did the countenance divine shine forth upon our clouded hills? And was Jerusalem builded here among these dark satanic mills? Now, if you sort of feel fondly about working conditions at the time, you're unlikely to describe the officers of the time as dark satanic mills. Similarly, a few decades before he wrote that, in another poem, London, I wander through each chartered street, near where the chartered Thames does flow, and mark in every face I meet marks of weakness, marks of woe. A sense that life is kind of drudgery and difficult and toil for the average person working in an industrial city like London. Another way to make sense of what was going on in the Industrial Revolution to the quality of work is to go to the philosophers. This man, Karl Marx, wrote Capital in 1867. It's the unpleasantness of work during the Industrial Revolution that prompts him to write so venomously and so critically about capitalism in his work. Extract from that book, Capital. They, the new technologies of his time, mutilate the laborer into a fragment of a man, degrade him to the level of an appendage of a machine, destroy every remnant of charm in his work, and turn it into a hated toil. Accumulation of wealth at one pole is therefore at the same time accumulation of misery, agony of toil, slavery, ignorance, brutality, mental degradation at the opposite pole. There's others too you can turn to. I found the writing of John Ruskin, the late 19th century writer, quite interesting, art historian, art critic, but also perhaps one of the first environmentalists. And what prompts him to become an environmentalist is in part what he sees around him in industrial Britain. So in a set of lectures delivered not far from here in February in 1884, he extracts from his diaries, 8:30, 3 times light and 3 times dark since last I wrote, and the darkness seeming each time as it settles more loathsome, at last stopping my reading in mere blindness. One lurid gleam of white cumulus in upper lead blue sky, seen for half a minute through the sulphurous chimney pot vomit of blackguardly cloud beneath, where its rags were thinnest. A sense that the quality of life, the quality of work in a place like London, extraordinary cauldron of technological activity, and yet the quality of work is not to be admired. Now, fast forward to today, I think there are legitimate concerns that new technologies, even if they do not affect the overall number of jobs, are eroding the quality of contemporary work in important ways. And it's not simply the pay of work, but I think if we think about, for instance, the platform economy and the work that has emerged on platforms in the last few years, the insecurity of the work, the extraordinary unpredictability of the work, there is still work to be done. New technologies are creating lots of new jobs. But in this dimension, thinking about the quality of work, it seems to me, again, there are reasons to be alive to the challenge of automation and to take automation anxiety seriously. I mean, one of the things I'm particularly struck by is thinking about the work created by the social media that we use, not simply those platforms, but the social media. What we often forget, I think, all too often, is that when a post, a picture, a video is flagged as inappropriate, perhaps because it's too violent, perhaps because it's of a sexual nature, whatever it might be, sometimes that's done in an automated way, but other times there's someone else, probably in another part of the world, whose job it is to sift through and identify which images can stay on the platform and which cannot. So again, a sense that these technologies are creating new work, but when we think about the quality of that work, there are reasons to be apprehensive. A third dimension I think is really important is the status of work that's being created in the economy today. One of the big questions that economists interested in the labor market, interested in the world of work, focus on is the question, how economically advantageous is it to be high-skilled rather than low-skilled? And when economists talk about being high-skilled, they tend to mean how economically advantageous is it to have a more formal education rather than less? And one very popular way of measuring this is known as the skill premium, which is the ratio of the average wage that you get if you go to college or university compared to the average wage that you might get if you go to high school. And what you see in the second half of the 20th century in many countries around the world is a rising skill premium, that what you get paid if you go to college or university relative to what you get paid if you don't is rising. There are returns to more education. And that's what we can see here in the United States from the early 1980s until the end of the century. 2008, the wage of an average college graduate in the United States relative to an average high school graduate reaches its highest level in decades. There's a sense that the return to education at the turn of the century is greater than it's ever been. And so an interesting question is why? What's driving this increase in the skill premium around the world? Why is it that education is becoming more and more valuable relative to not having an education? And the most compelling answer, it seems to me, is because of technological progress. In the late 1950s and early 1960s, businesses start to make extensive use of mainframe computers. Then the PC is invented and starts to spread. So as late as the 1980s, the US had fewer than one PC per 100 people, but by the turn of the century, that's 60 per 100 people. And crucially, of course, these machines just become far more capable. And one way of thinking about this capability is what happened to just simply the processing power of these machines in the second half of the 20th century. So I'm using here an index of computations per second as a measure of computational power, how powerful these computers, these machines are. What you can see from 1850 until 1950 is that it's relatively flat. Not a lot seems to happen. And then at that dashed line, starting in 1950, you get what looks like a relatively linear takeoff, a relatively linear increase in computational power. Only the key point to note here is that that is not a linear increase. The Any mathematicians in the room or online will notice that the y-axis there is a logarithmic axis. So each step up is a 10-fold increase in computational power. 2 steps, 100-fold. 3 steps, 1,000-fold. 4 steps, 10,000-fold. And so what you're looking at here is quite literally an explosive, an exponential increase in computational power. From 1950 to 2000, computational power, what you're seeing here, increases by roughly a factor of 10 billion. Now, these powerful machines might have been able to handle certain tasks, but they didn't do away with the demand for labor, demand for human beings altogether. In fact, what happened was they led to far greater demand for high-skilled people who had more formal education, who were able to operate these machines, who were able to use the spreadsheets and the word processing software and so on, and put it all to productive use. So technological progress didn't benefit all workers equally. It was, as economists say, skill-biased. So that's what's going on here in thinking about the US skill premium. Now just pause that rising skill premium in the 20th century for a moment and look at this, which is the English skill premium from 1220 to 2000. So we're lucky in England that we have data that stretches that far back. English institutions proven to be remarkably stable and uncommonly assiduous in their record keeping for essentially a millennia. Given there were few college degrees back in 1220, the skill premium here is instead measured by comparing the wages of craftsmen, who were the skilled workers of the time, relative to laborers. And what we can see here is that over the longer run, when you step out of the 20th century, the skill premium no longer follows the same upward pattern that we saw before in the US in the 20th century. So take the 19th century, when the Industrial Revolution is unfolding. There's a sort of popular picture of the Industrial Revolution that depicts a wave of machines displacing low-skilled workers from their roles. People who made their living sort of spinning thread or wefting cloth with their bare hands and basic tools, finding themselves without work. But this is not what happened. It was high-skilled workers of the time who were under threat. It turned out that those without skills were best placed to put these new technologies during the Industrial Revolution to particularly effective use. What you can see here in short in that red circle is that the skill premium during the 19th century appears to be falling in England. So go back to Ned Ludd, the apocryphal leader of the Luddite uprising against automation. He was a skilled worker of his age. He wasn't an unskilled one. If he actually existed, he would have been a professional of sorts, perhaps even a sort of card-carrying member of the worshipful company of cloth workers, a prestigious club that existed for people of his trade at the time. And the mechanical looms that displaced Ned and his comrades meant that someone with less skill, without Ned's specialized training, could take his place. These machines were de-skilling, making it easier for less skilled people to do the kind of work that might have required skilled workers in the past. And that's what's going on here when you look at the declining skill premium during the Industrial Revolution. Now, why does that matter today? Fast forward to today, I think, again, there are legitimate concerns that new technologies, even if they're not affecting the overall number of jobs, are eroding the status of certain types of work. So take Dario Amodei again, the man who founded the AI company Anthropic. He made a prediction a few months ago that AI could wipe out half of all entry-level white-collar jobs and spike unemployment to 10 to 20% in the next 1 to 5 years. White-collar jobs, the skilled people of the time. And various publications picked this up. Axios called these predictions a white-collar bloodbath. The New York Post, white-collar workers displaced by AI could spark a revolution. The Wall Street Journal CEOs start saying the quiet part out loud. Literally half of all white-collar workers are at risk. The story that most of us have grown up in, is a story like the one that we saw in the 20th century, where if you get more education, more formal education, if you accumulate more skills, technological progress is going to benefit you. That's where the sort of the status is in the labor market. Those are the growing, better paid parts of the world of work. I think there is potentially a story emerging now which looks a lot more like what we saw during the Industrial Revolution, where these technologies, remarkably powerful technologies, challenged the skilled workers of the time, and it was unskilled workers who were able to use these technologies to do things that would have been unimaginable in the past. The final dimension I want to turn to this evening for why we ought to take automation anxiety seriously is the idea of power. Go back to this Engels pause chart from before. This idea that until 1840, the economy is growing, people seem to be contributing more to the economy, but real wages are roughly constant, not a lot's happening. The gains from whatever productivity increases are happening are not going to workers in the form of pay. Who are they going to? Well, those profits are going to people like Richard Arkwright, the developer of the spinning frame, father of the modern industrial factory system, who owned factories around the country. They're going to people like Sir Robert Peel the Elder, early textile manufacturer during the Industrial Revolution. They're going to people like John Iron Mad Wilkinson, who pioneered the manufacture and use of cast iron during the Industrial Revolution. And he was said to be iron mad because gradually, as he came to the end of his life, he started trying to turn everything around him into iron. So he was buried in an iron coffin, and there is currently still an iron obelisk standing where he is supposedly buried in Cumbria. And then people like Josiah Wedgwood, the potter. These figures, though, didn't just accumulate extraordinary economic power during their lives. They also accumulated extraordinary political power as well. And in some cases, it was traditional political power in the sense that traditional grand chambers of state and traditional politics. So people who know their history will know Sir Robert Peel the Elder was the father of Sir Robert Peel, our two-time Prime Minister. But more generally, these people who were designing these technologies, through the technologies, by affecting our working lives, reshaped this kind of social scaffolding on which British society operated. Fast forward to today, and I think, again, you can tell a very similar story about what is unfolding in the world today when we think about those who are responsible for developing the extraordinary technologies that we are using in our working lives. Again, part of the story is the extraordinary economic power of these large companies. Companies like Meta, companies like Amazon, companies like Google, extraordinarily profitable. But it's also the political power, and it's not just the sort of again, traditional political power. So this photo was taken at President Trump's recent inauguration, the leaders of the large technology companies all lined up there. It's not just, though, political power in that traditional sense. These technologies, in much the same way, shape this social scaffolding on which we all live our lives. Today, technologies constrain our liberty. A seller can be blocked from advertising certain goods in an online market. A cryptocurrency holder can forget their wallet key and lose their fortune to the blockchain. An electric bike rider can be prevented from going above a set speed or cycling on certain roads. In a sense, these technologies already constrain our liberty. They determine questions of social justice. There are algorithms that decide which applicants get a job, which citizens get social housing, which borrowers receive a financial loan, which prisoners are released on parole, which patients receive health treatment. And technologies shape our democracy. Search engines sort and shape what information we receive. Online media platforms sift and select which conversations we take part in. Social media determines who is amplified and who is muted. So let's just take all of this together and ask the question, how should we think about automation anxiety today? How should we think about all the books and articles and reports on the threat of automation? And I would, to which I might add, my own books on this as well. How should we think about this? I think a really important lesson for us today is not only to focus on how new technologies like AI might affect the number of jobs, and I will turn to that in later lectures, but I also, again, want to emphasize the point that we've got to pay attention to how these technologies affect the nature of those jobs as well. What we saw during the Industrial Revolution was that although those worries about the number of jobs turned out to be wrong, in lots of different dimensions that we think are important, the nature of those jobs changed for the worse, whether it was pay, whether it was the quality of the work, whether it was the status of the work, and whether it were the broader power imbalances in society. So in my view, I think we can catch a glimpse of all of these today, and it might be tempting to dismiss automation anxiety, but in truth, I think if we look at the world of work as it's unfolding already, we can already see new technologies changing work in all these different dimensions once again. So let me just close by giving you a little taster of the next lecture in a few weeks' time on the economics of technology and work. Why has automation anxiety proven to be wrong? Why was it that our anxious ancestors time and again turned out to worried and time and again turned out to be wrong? The next lecture, I want to explore how technology affects the labor market. And what we're going to see is that while new technologies can substitute for workers, reducing demand for their effort at certain activities, they can also complement them. They can also increase the demand for them to do other activities that haven't yet been automated. And it turns out that historically, people have overwhelmingly, and I think understandably, focused on that harmful side of technological progress. The fact that these technologies might substitute for the work that we do, displacing us from our jobs. But we've tended time and again to forget that second helpful side of technology, that it can also increase demand for tasks and activities that haven't yet been automated. And that is going to turn out to be really very important in both understanding historically why automation anxiety has been misplaced, but also in the future, understanding why automation anxiety, particularly with respect to the number of jobs, why in fact this time might be different. So I will finish there. Thank you very much, everyone, for your attention, and I look forward now to hearing some reflections and taking some questions as well. So thank you very much indeed. Thank you.